When Officer Lucas Hayes, a seasoned yet infamously controversial cop, stops a young black man on a quiet suburban street, he assumes it's just another routine show of authority. His disdain is evident, his prejudices unchecked. But as Lucas's actions spiral into violence, a horrifying misunderstanding unfolds. The boy is not resisting arrest. He's physically incapable of doing so. The onlookers who witness the scene refuse to stay silent. Their smartphones record every agonizing second. Rage boils over in the crowd. What begins as another shameful act of abuse by those in power takes a shocking turn, and Officer Hayes learns too late that justice will not be served in the way he expected. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. An ordinary day turned dark. It was an early summer morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Officer Ryan Grant sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee as the sun peeked through the clouds. Grant had served in the local police force for over 15 years, but his reputation was marred by allegations of racial bias and excessive force, none of which had ever led to disciplinary action. Across the street, 14-year-old Marcus Daniels strolled along the sidewalk. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he carried a small backpack. Marcus was a quiet, artistic boy with a love for drawing wildlife. He was on his way to the park, where he often sketched in the shade of a tall oak tree. Marcus had autism, which made social interactions and following rapid instructions difficult, but he had a kind heart and a gentle smile. From his patrol car, Grant noticed Marcus walking slowly. His eyes narrowed. To Grant, Marcus didn't fit the image of someone who belonged in the affluent neighborhood. He watched as Marcus stopped near a tree, adjusting his backpack straps and humming softly to himself, a calming habit he often used when anxious. "Loitering," Grant muttered, setting his coffee down. He flicked on his lights and stepped out of the car. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Grant barked, his voice cutting through the calm morning air. Startled, Marcus froze. He turned to face the officer, his hands flapping slightly. A behavior he used to manage sensory overload, but to Grant it looked like nervousness, even guilt. "What are you doing here?" Grant demanded, closing the distance between them. Marcus's heart pounded. He wanted to answer but struggled to find the words. The louder Grant became, the harder it was for Marcus to process what was happening. "I said, what are you doing here?" Grant repeated, stepping closer. Park," Marcus finally stammered, his voice barely audible. Grant's eyes narrowed further. "Park, huh? What's in the bag?" Without waiting for an answer, he snatched the backpack off Marcus's shoulder and unzipped it. Inside, he found a sketch pad, colored pencils, and a water bottle. He held up the sketch pad, flipping through pages of intricate drawings of birds and trees. "This yours?" Grant sneered. Marcus nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "What are you hiding? Drugs? Weapons?" Grant's tone was accusatory, and his grip on Marcus's shoulder tightened. "I didn't do anything," Marcus managed to say, his voice trembling. A few neighbors had started to notice the interaction. One man leaned against his fence, his phone in hand. A jogger slowed down, watching the scene unfold with concern. Grant, oblivious to the growing attention, grabbed Marcus by the arm. "Don't play games with me, kid. You're coming with me." Marcus panicked, pulling back instinctively. His inability to communicate escalated his fear, and his movements became more erratic. "Stop resisting!" Grant yelled, forcing Marcus against the tree. "Please, stop," Marcus whispered, his body shaking. By now a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. A woman called out, "Leave him alone, he's just a kid." Grant glanced at the onlookers, but dismissed their protests. In his mind, he was in control. "Let's see how tough you are," Grant growled, pulling a rope from his utility bag. The crowd gasped, several people pulling out their phones to record. Marcus, frozen in terror, didn't resist as Grant looped the rope around his wrists and secured it to a low-hanging branch. "You're gonna learn not to mess around here," Grant said coldly, tightening the rope. "Stop this, he has a disability," a man shouted, stepping forward. Grant ignored him, but the crowd wasn't silent anymore. "Someone call the police on this guy. This is abuse. He's not resisting, he's scared." The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd's anger was growing, and so was their courage. The crowd awakens. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a roar. What had started as quiet disapproval now echoed with shouts of outrage. Phones were raised, capturing every second of Officer Grant's actions. Several bystanders stepped closer, their indignation overtaking their initial hesitation. "Take that rope off him," a middle-aged woman yelled, pointing an accusing finger at Grant. "He's not a criminal, he's just a child." Grant turned briefly to face the growing crowd. His grip on the rope remained firm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Back off," he shouted, his voice attempting to regain authority. "This is police business. Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." The warning didn't have its intended effect. If anything, it emboldened the onlookers. Among them was Laura Garcia, a mother of two who had just finished her morning jog. Her hands shook as she live-streamed the scene to her social media page, narrating in disbelief. "This officer is tying up a child in front of all of us," Laura said, her voice cracking with anger. "He's not resisting. He's scared. Look at his face." She zoomed in on Marcus, whose eyes were wide with terror as his hands twitched in the rope's restraints. Nearby, John Carter, a former Marine and local community leader, pushed through the crowd to stand directly in Grant's line of sight. John was tall and commanding, his presence alone enough to give pause. "Officer," John began, his tone measured but firm, "this has gone too far. Let the boy go." Grant's jaw tightened. "Step away," he barked. "This kid is acting suspiciously, and I have the right to detain him." "For what?" John countered, crossing his arms. "Sketching in the park, being a black teenager? This is abuse of power, plain and simple." "I'm doing my job," Grant snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced at Marcus, whose trembling had become more pronounced. The boy's breathing was shallow and his head hung low, his body unable to cope with the overwhelming sensory input. "Your job," John's voice rose, filled with incredulity. "Your job is to protect and serve, not terrorize children." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices blending into a cacophony of demands. "Untie him. Where's your humanity? We've got this all on video." Grant's hand hovered over his holstered weapon, a reflexive motion that sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. The sight of his fingers brushing the gun's grip silenced some of the louder shouts, but not John's. "Don't you dare," John warned, stepping even closer. "You pull that weapon, and this will go national faster than you can blink. Look around, officer. You've already lost." Grant's gaze darted from John to the surrounding crowd. He counted at least 20 phones pointed at him, recording from every angle. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on him, a stark reminder that his actions were under a glaring spotlight. Meanwhile, Laura's live stream was gaining traction. Comments poured in as viewers from across the city and beyond reacted in real time. "This is disgusting. Someone call 911 on him. I can't believe this is happening in broad daylight. Share this video. This officer needs to be stopped." Back at the scene, Marcus's quiet sobs broke through the noise. The sound hit the crowd like a hammer, stirring their anger into something more primal. A young man in his 20s, wearing a hoodie and carrying a skateboard, stepped forward. "You think you're tough?" he shouted at Grant. "How about you try that with someone your own size?" "Enough!" Grant roared, his voice cracking. He yanked the rope, forcing Marcus's arms higher. "This is what happens when you break the law." The crowd surged forward as one. Laura screamed, "He's going to hurt him!" and several people rushed to intervene. John reached Marcus first, his strong hands gripping the rope and pulling it loose. "Get back!" Grant shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the collective fury of the crowd. In the chaos, a man from the back threw a plastic water bottle, striking Grant's shoulder. Another woman shouted, "We'll take him down ourselves if we have to." The officer took a step back, his hand now firmly on his weapon. But before he could act, John stood in front of him, raising both hands. "Don't escalate this," John said, his voice steady. "Let the boy go and walk away." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Grant's eyes darted between the crowd, the boy, and the man towering before him. His breathing was shallow, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Slowly, reluctantly, he released the rope. Marcus crumpled to the ground, his knees scraping against the dirt. The crowd cheered, but their anger remained palpable. Several people surrounded Marcus, shielding him from further harm. Laura handed him a bottle of water, her hands trembling as she crouched beside him. "It's okay, sweetie," she said softly. "You're safe now." Grant, now visibly flustered, backed away toward his patrol car. The crowd followed, their voices a chorus of condemnation. "Shame on you. You're a disgrace. We'll make sure you never wear a badge again." Grant climbed into his vehicle and slammed the door, his face red with humiliation. As he drove away, the crowd erupted into applause and chants of "Justice for Marcus, the power of the people." As the sound of Officer Grant's car faded into the distance, the crowd in the park seemed to exhale collectively. Marcus was still sitting on the ground, his head hanging low, his breaths shallow and uneven. His hands twitched uncontrollably, a visible sign of his sensory overload. Laura knelt beside him, her voice soothing. "You're okay, sweetie. We're here. Can you hear me?" Marcus didn't respond, his mind still trapped in the overwhelming moment. Laura exchanged a worried glance with John, who crouched down and gently touched Marcus's shoulder. "He needs medical attention," John said. "Someone call an ambulance." "I'm on it," a man in the crowd replied, pulling out his phone. Nearby others were huddled together, replaying the videos they had captured. Every frame told the story. A boy with a disability, tied to a tree by an officer abusing his power. The footage was raw, undeniable, and infuriating. "This has to go viral," a young woman named Tasha said, her voice trembling with emotion. She was one of the first to upload her video, captioning it, "Racist cop assaults disabled boy, share this now." Within minutes, the hashtag #Justice for Marcus began trending. Comments poured in, amplifying the outrage. "I'm shaking watching this. We can't let him get away with this. Tag every news outlet you know." John, still focused on Marcus, spoke softly. "Son, can you tell me your name?" Marcus looked up briefly, his eyes glassy. His lips moved, but no words came out. Instead, he pulled his knees to his chest, rocking slightly, a self-soothing gesture that broke John's heart. "Marcus," a voice called from the edge of the park. A woman in her mid-30s came running, her face a mask of fear and anguish. It was Lisa, Marcus's mother. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her son, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "I'm here now, I'm here." The crowd watched in silence, their anger momentarily giving way to sorrow. Laura stepped forward, placing a hand on Lisa's shoulder. "We saw everything," she said gently. "We're going to make sure that officer pays for what he did." Lisa looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with gratitude and determination. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for standing up for him." The ambulance arrived moments later, its sirens cutting through the tense atmosphere. Paramedics rushed to Marcus, carefully assessing his condition. They spoke softly to him, their movements deliberate and gentle. Lisa climbed into the ambulance with her son, holding his hand tightly. Before the doors closed, Lisa turned to the crowd. "Don't let him get away with this," she pleaded. "Please." John stepped forward, raising a hand to signal the crowd. "We won't," he promised. "Not now, not ever." The video goes viral. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the videos of the incident had already spread across social media like wildfire. Major news outlets picked up the story, replaying the footage in loops during their broadcasts. "This is a shocking example of police misconduct," one anchor said. "The question now is, what will the authorities do about it?" In Lisa's living room, family and friends gathered to support her. The phone rang incessantly. Reporters, activists, lawyers, all wanting to offer help or ask for statements. Lisa, overwhelmed but resolute, decided to speak out. She sat on the couch with Marcus beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. With trembling hands, she held up her phone and hit the record button. "My name is Lisa Carter," she began, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yesterday, my son Marcus was attacked by someone who was supposed to protect him. Marcus has autism. He's a sweet, gentle boy who doesn't deserve what happened to him." Her words were raw, filled with pain and conviction. She described the incident in detail, her voice breaking as she recounted the moment Grant tied Marcus to the tree. "This isn't just about my son," she said. This is about every child who's been judged, mistreated, or hurt because of ignorance and hate. We demand accountability. We demand justice." The video was posted with the caption, "A mother's plea for her son." Within hours, it had millions of views. Celebrities shared it, calling for action. Activists organized a rally at the park where the incident occurred, demanding Officer Grant's arrest. Community uprising. On the day of the rally, hundreds gathered at the park holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," "End police brutality," and "Protect our kids." The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and solidarity. John took the stage first, his booming voice carrying over the crowd. "We will not stand by while those in power abuse their authority," he declared. "Marcus deserves justice and we won't stop until he gets it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. One by one, speakers took the stage, community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens who had been moved by Marcus's story. Each voice added to the growing call for change. Lisa was the final speaker. She stood tall despite her exhaustion, her eyes scanning the sea of supporters. "Thank you for being here," she began. "Thank you for fighting for my son when he couldn't fight for himself." She took a deep breath, her voice trembling but strong. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to wear a badge. It's about a society that needs to do better. For Marcus, for your children, for all of us." Tears filled her eyes as the crowd chanted, "Justice for Marcus." The system under scrutiny. The ripple effect of Marcus's story reached far beyond the small town where it had unfolded. National news outlets featured his face, his shy, innocent smile juxtaposed with the horrifying footage of his mistreatment. Protests spread to neighboring cities, and the name Marcus Carter became a rallying cry for justice and reform. Lisa's house had become a hub of activity. Community leaders, activists, and even lawyers crowded her living room, strategizing their next moves. Papers and notebooks covered every surface, each page a piece of the growing fight against systemic injustice. "We need to push for Grant's immediate suspension," said Clara Martinez, a local civil rights attorney. "And we won't stop there. The department needs to answer for this." Lisa, though exhausted, nodded firmly. "He can't keep his badge," she said, "not after what he did to my son." The department's response. Under immense pressure, the local police department held a press conference. Cameras flashed as Chief Walter Daniels approached the podium, flanked by other officials. His expression was grim, the weight of the situation evident in his posture. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Grant and Marcus Carter," Daniels began, his voice measured. "Let me be clear, this department does not condone the actions seen in that video. Effective immediately, Officer Grant has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation." The statement did little to quell the growing anger. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into chaos. "Chief Daniels, why was Grant not removed sooner given his history of complaints? What steps are being taken to prevent incidents like this in the future? Does the department accept responsibility for Marcus's trauma?" Daniels raised a hand to silence the room. "We are committed to transparency and accountability," he said. "This is an opportunity to re-evaluate our practices and ensure this never happens again." But the public wasn't satisfied. As the press conference ended, the hashtag #OneFireGrant trended alongside #Justice for Marcus. Social media erupted with calls for systemic change, demanding not just the removal of Officer Grant, but a complete overhaul of the department, a troubled history. As journalists dug deeper into Grant's record, disturbing details emerged. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional behavior had been filed against him for years. In one instance, a black teenager accused Grant of using unnecessary force during a routine traffic stop, leaving him with a broken arm. Another report detailed an incident where Grant allegedly berated a Latino family for speaking Spanish in public. "These records paint a clear picture," Clara told Lisa during a late-night strategy meeting. "Grant's behavior has been a problem for years, and the department turned a blind eye. That makes them complicit." Lisa's jaw tightened. "They let him hurt people. They let him hurt my son." Clara placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure they answer for it. every single one of them. The grand jury decision. 2 weeks after the incident, a grand jury convened to determine whether charges should be filed against Officer Grant. The community anxiously awaited the decision, their emotions swinging between hope and dread. Lisa and Marcus were called to testify, a moment both powerful and painful. Lisa spoke with unwavering conviction, recounting the events of that day and the impact on her family. "My son is afraid to leave the house," she said, her voice breaking. "He doesn't sleep. He doesn't talk like he used to. This man didn't just hurt him physically, he stole his sense of safety." When Marcus took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He clutched his mother's hand tightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. With Lisa's gentle encouragement, he described the terror he felt when Grant tied him to the tree. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "I was just scared." The prosecution rested its case, presenting the video evidence and witness testimonies that left little room for doubt. The defense, in contrast, struggled to justify Grant's actions, arguing that he had acted in the heat of the moment. The grand jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a decision. Officer Grant would be indicted on charges of assault, child endangerment, and misconduct in office. The community reacts news of the indictment spread like wildfire, sparking celebrations across the community. At the park where the incident occurred, hundreds gathered for a vigil in Marcus's honor. Candles illuminated the night as people shared stories, sang songs, and reaffirmed their commitment to justice. Lisa stood before the crowd, holding Marcus close. "This is a step in the right direction," she said. "But it's not the end. We won't stop until there's accountability for every family who suffered like we have." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. A growing movement. As the legal battle against Grant began, the fight for broader reform gained momentum. Activists called for changes to police training, demanding mandatory courses on de-escalation and disability awareness. Community leaders advocated for independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct, ensuring that no officer could operate with impunity. Marcus's story became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring people across the country to speak out against injustice. Lisa, though reluctant at first, embraced her role as an advocate, traveling to other cities to share her family's story and push for change. "We can't bring back the moments that were stolen from us," she said at one rally, "but we can make sure no one else has to go through this." The trial of Officer Grant. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation as the trial of Officer Roger Grant began. News crews crowded the steps outside, their cameras capturing every arrival. Activists held signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and accountability now," their chants echoing through the halls of justice. Inside, Lisa sat with Marcus by her side, their lawyer Clara Martinez beside them. Marcus clutched his sketchpad, his hands trembling slightly. Despite his fear, he knew this day was about more than just him. It was about standing up for every victim who had been silenced. The prosecution's case. The prosecution opened with a searing statement. Officer Roger Grant abused his authority, violated the trust of the community, and inflicted lasting harm on a vulnerable boy, the prosecutor declared. This case is not just about one officer. It's about a system that enabled his behavior. They presented the video footage as their centerpiece, playing the harrowing scene for the jury. Gasps filled the courtroom as the images of Grant tying Marcus to the tree unfolded. The sound of Marcus's muffled cries echoed through the room, leaving no one unmoved. Witnesses took the stand one by one, recounting the events of that day. A jogger who had filmed the incident described the growing outrage of the crowd. "We couldn't just stand there and watch," she said, her voice breaking. "What he did was inhumane." The prosecution also introduced Grant's history of complaints, painting a clear picture of a man who had abused his power repeatedly. Records showed a pattern of excessive force, racial bias, and misconduct, all swept under the rug by his superiors. Lisa's testimony was the most emotional. She spoke about Marcus's struggles with his disability and how Grant's actions had shattered his sense of security. "My son is not a threat," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He's a child, and no child deserves to be treated like that." The defense's argument Grant's defense team tried to shift the narrative, arguing that he had acted out of concern for public safety. They portrayed Marcus as uncooperative and Grant as a seasoned officer who had made a mistake in a high-pressure situation. He was doing his job, the defense attorney claimed. While his actions may have been excessive, they were not malicious. But the jury remained unconvinced. The video evidence contradicted the defense's narrative, showing a deliberate escalation of violence rather than an attempt to de-escalate. Grant himself took the stand, his demeanor a mix of arrogance and defiance. "I've served this community for 15 years, he said. "I've made countless arrests and kept these streets safe. I didn't mean to hurt the boy. It was a misunderstanding." The cross-examination was brutal. Clara Martinez dismantled his claims, pointing out the inconsistencies in his testimony and highlighting his history of bias. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice sharp, "do you truly believe that tying a disabled child to a tree was an appropriate response to suspicious behavior?" Grant hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. I thought he was resisting," he muttered. Clara's eyes bore into him. "Did you ever stop to ask why? Did you ever consider that his behavior might have been a result of his disability?" Grant's silence spoke volumes. Marcus's moment. The prosecution's final witness was Marcus himself. Though he was nervous, Marcus found strength in his mother's reassuring presence. With Clara guiding him gently, he recounted the events in his own words. "I didn't know why he was yelling at me," Marcus said softly. "I was scared. I didn't understand what I did wrong." His testimony was brief but powerful. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, the jury hanging on every word. For the first time, they saw Marcus not as a name in a case file, but as a living, breathing boy who had been deeply hurt. The verdict. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was excruciating for Lisa and Marcus. Supporters surrounded them, offering words of encouragement, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on their hearts. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, her expression neutral as she read the verdict. "On the count of assault, we find the defendant, Roger Grant, guilty. On the count of child endangerment, we find the defendant, Roger Grant, guilty. On the count of misconduct in office, we find the defendant, Roger Grant, guilty." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Lisa hugged Marcus tightly, tears streaming down her face. The crowd outside erupted in cheers as the news spread, their chants of "justice for Marcus" reaching a triumphant crescendo. Grant's sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but for the community the verdict was a victory, a sign that accountability was possible, a symbol of hope. As Lisa and Marcus left the courthouse, they were greeted by a sea of supporters. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and people held signs with messages of solidarity. Marcus, overwhelmed but smiling faintly, clung to his mother's hand. "This is just the beginning," Lisa told the crowd. "We've won one battle, but the fight for justice continues. We have to keep pushing for change, not just here, but everywhere." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the evening sky. Marcus looked up at his mother, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Are you ready to keep fighting?" Lisa asked him gently. Marcus nodded. "I think so." The ripple effect. The guilty verdict against Officer Roger Grant sent shockwaves through the small town of Fairhope and beyond. It was a landmark moment, not only for Marcus and his family, but also for communities across the nation grappling with systemic issues in law enforcement. The trial had exposed the ugly truths about unchecked authority and ignited a movement that couldn't be ignored. Reform and resistance. In the wake of the trial, Fairhope's City Council held an emergency meeting to address public demands for police reform. Activists, community leaders, and citizens flooded the town hall, voicing their frustrations and proposing solutions. Lisa stood at the podium, her voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about my son. It's about every family that's been affected by abuse of power. We need accountability, we need transparency, and we need to rebuild trust." The council members listened intently, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Under immense public pressure, they introduced a series of reforms: mandatory bias training for officers, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and stricter policies for handling complaints against law enforcement. But the reforms were met with resistance from the local police union. Some officers claimed the changes were unnecessary and accused the community of vilifying the department. "We're being unfairly targeted," one officer said during a press conference. "Most of us serve with honor. Don't let the actions of one man define us all." The division between the police and the community deepened, but Lisa remained undeterred. "This isn't about targeting good officers," she said in response. "It's about holding bad ones accountable and ensuring that tragedies like Marcus's never happen again." Marcus's journey to healing. As the town grappled with change, Marcus began his own journey toward healing. Therapy sessions helped him process the trauma he had endured, and he found solace in expressing himself through art. His drawings became a powerful outlet for his emotions, often depicting scenes of hope and resilience. One day, during a therapy session, Marcus shared a new sketch with his therapist, a vibrant depiction of the park where the incident had occurred, with children of all backgrounds playing together under a sprawling tree. "This is how I want the park to feel again," Marcus said softly. "Safe." His therapist encouraged him to share his artwork with others. Reluctant at first, Marcus eventually agreed to display his pieces at a local community center. The exhibit, titled "Through Marcus's Eyes," drew hundreds of visitors and received widespread praise. Each drawing told a story of pain, strength, and hope, inspiring others to reflect on their own biases and the importance of empathy. Lisa watched with pride as her son stood by his artwork, shyly answering questions from visitors. For the first time in months, she saw a glimmer of confidence returning to his demeanor. The community rally's Fairhope's residents rallied around Marcus and his family, organizing events to promote unity and healing. A candlelight vigil was held at the park, where community members shared their stories and vowed to fight for justice and equity. During the vigil, Lucas, the jogger who had captured the incident on video, spoke about the power of collective action. "It wasn't just one person who stood up that day, it was all of us. And that's what it will take to create lasting change." The crowd held their candles high as Lisa addressed them, her voice filled with gratitude. "You stood with us when we needed you most. Now let's stand together for every family, every child, and every community that deserves justice." The park, once a symbol of trauma for Marcus, began to transform. Community leaders announced plans to rename it Marcus's Garden and install a new play area with inclusive features for children with disabilities. Murals depicting unity and resilience were painted on nearby walls, turning the park into a beacon of hope. A national movement. The impact of Marcus's story extended far beyond Fairhope. News outlets, social media platforms, and advocacy groups amplified his story, sparking a nationwide conversation about police reform and the treatment of marginalized communities. The hashtags "Justice for Marcus" and "Just Change for All" trended for weeks, with celebrities and politicians weighing in. Activists used Marcus's story as a rallying cry to demand broader systemic changes, from increased oversight of law enforcement to better training on interacting with individuals with disabilities. Lisa was invited to speak at conferences, rallies, and town halls across the country. Though she was initially hesitant, she recognized the importance of using her voice to advocate for others. "If my son's story can prevent even one more tragedy, then it's worth sharing," she said during a televised interview. Marcus occasionally joined her, his sketches serving as a visual representation of their journey. One particularly moving piece, a drawing of a boy standing under a tree with his arms outstretched, became the centerpiece of their advocacy. Prints of the artwork were sold to raise funds for disability awareness programs, with Marcus proudly signing each one. Officer Grant's sentence. As the community moved forward, Officer Roger Grant awaited sentencing. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, citing the lasting harm he had caused and his history of misconduct. During the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke. "Your actions were not only a gross abuse of power, but also a betrayal of the trust placed in you as an officer of the law," the judge said. "This court will not tolerate such behavior." Grant was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a decision that was met with relief by Marcus's family and their supporters. Though the sentence couldn't erase the pain he had caused, it was a step toward accountability. A new chapter. Months later, on a sunny spring day, the community gathered for the official renaming of Marcus's garden. The park was filled with laughter and joy as children played on the new equipment, their families watching from picnic tables adorned with balloons and flowers. Lisa and Marcus stood near the entrance, unveiling a plaque that read, "Marcus's Garden, a place for unity, resilience, and hope." The crowd erupted into applause as Marcus smiled shyly, his hands gripping the edges of the plaque. "You did this," Lisa whispered to her son. "Your strength inspired all of this." As Marcus looked around at the transformed park, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had been replaced by something stronger, a sense of purpose and hope for the future, a reckoning. While Fairhope celebrated the strides toward justice and healing, the ripple effects of Marcus's story continued to reverberate nationally. Communities across the country were inspired to scrutinize their own systems of power and accountability, igniting movements that sought to dismantle entrenched injustices. The call for broader reform. With Marcus's law now being considered at the state level, the proposed legislation became a flashpoint for debate. The bill aimed to mandate police de-escalation training, introduce mandatory disability awareness programs, and establish independent oversight boards in every precinct. Opponents of the bill claimed it would make policing more difficult. "We can't protect communities if we're constantly second-guessing ourselves," one officer said during a heated public forum. Supporters, however, argued that accountability and effective training would lead to better outcomes for everyone. Lisa, speaking at the state capitol, countered these criticisms with her signature poise. "Protecting communities starts with understanding them," she said. "My son wasn't a threat. He was a child. And if this law can prevent even one more tragedy, then it's not just necessary, it's overdue." Her words resonated deeply, earning applause from both lawmakers and citizens. The committee voted overwhelmingly to advance the bill, setting it up for a full vote in the legislature. Grant's sentence and its fallout. As Roger Grant settled into his prison sentence, his name became synonymous with abuse of power. Advocacy groups used his case as an example of what unchecked authority could lead to, while police reform activists called for more stringent measures to prevent similar incidents. From his cell, Grant watched as his former colleagues distanced themselves from him. He had become a pariah, not only in Fairhope, but also within law enforcement circles. Letters from his family were filled with disappointment and anger, with one relative writing, "You've embarrassed us all." Grant's isolation deepened when a fellow inmate, recognizing him from the news, confronted him. "You think that badge makes you better than us?" the man sneered. "Out here you're just another convict." The encounter left Grant shaken, forcing him to confront the gravity of his actions for the first time. Alone in his cell, he replayed the events of that fateful day, each memory an unbearable weight on his conscience. The media spotlight. The national media continued to focus on Fairhope, framing the town as a microcosm of the larger struggle for justice and reform. Documentaries and investigative reports delved into the systemic issues exposed by Marcus's case, shedding light on similar stories across the country. One such documentary, Through Marcus's Eyes, featured interviews with Lisa, Marcus, and other key figures. The film highlighted the human cost of inaction and the power of collective resilience. At the premiere, Marcus sat nervously in the front row, holding Lisa's hand. As the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, he saw his story unfold in a way that was both humbling and empowering. When the credits rolled, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Lisa leaned over and whispered, "This is your story, baby. Look what you've done." The garden grows back in Fairhope. Marcus's garden became a beloved community space. Families gathered there to picnic, children played freely, and local artists held workshops under the shade of the newly planted trees. The park had transformed from a site of pain to a symbol of hope and renewal. One afternoon, Marcus joined a group of children painting a mural on the park's wall. The design featured outstretched hands of different colors, encircling a tree that mirrored the one he had drawn so many times. As he worked, a little girl approached him, holding a crayon. "Did you make all this?" she asked, her eyes wide with admiration. Marcus hesitated before nodding. "I helped," he said softly. The girl beamed. "It's really pretty." Marcus smiled, her words a small but profound reminder of the impact he had made. A community united Fairhope's transformation extended beyond the park. The town implemented new community programs, including workshops on implicit bias, town halls to foster dialogue, and partnerships with organizations advocating for marginalized groups. Lucas, the jogger who had recorded the incident, became a leader in these efforts. He organized events that brought together residents and law enforcement, creating opportunities for understanding and collaboration. At one such event, an officer admitted, "That day in the park opened my eyes. We need to do better, and I'm committed to being part of the solution." Marcus's story also inspired a new generation of activists. High school students formed clubs dedicated to social justice, organizing marches and fundraisers to support causes they believed in. Teachers incorporated lessons on empathy and inclusion into their curriculums, ensuring that the next generation would carry the torch. The broader legacy. Marcus and Lisa's journey sparked a nationwide reckoning, with cities across the country adopting similar reforms. Police departments revamped their training programs, lawmakers passed new accountability measures, and communities found hope in the possibility of change. Despite the progress, Lisa knew the fight wasn't over. "This is a marathon, not a sprint," she said during a keynote speech. "But if we keep moving forward, step by step, we'll get to where we need to be." Marcus, now more confident than ever, stood beside her, holding a framed sketch of his tree. "We can grow stronger," he said simply. His words, though few, carried the weight of a movement. Justice, growth, and a call to action. The echoes of Marcus's story stretched far beyond the borders of Fairhope. What had begun as a harrowing tragedy evolved into a beacon of hope and resilience for communities across the globe. Marcus, now 18, found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't sought, but had embraced with quiet courage. A life rebuilt. Marcus's progress was remarkable. Through therapy and support from his family and community, he blossomed into a young man who, while still processing his trauma, carried himself with newfound confidence. His artwork gained widespread recognition, with exhibitions in galleries and community centers highlighting his unique perspective on resilience and hope. One of his most cherished moments came when he was invited to speak at a national youth conference. Standing before thousands, Marcus clutched a small drawing of his tree. His voice was soft but steady as he said, "We all have roots. Sometimes they're shaken, but they don't break. We can grow stronger together." The applause that followed brought tears to Lisa's eyes. Her son, once silenced by fear, had found his voice. Fairhope's ongoing transformation. In Fairhope, Marcus's garden became a symbol of unity. Community events such as art workshops, mindfulness sessions, and open forums drew residents together in ways they hadn't imagined possible. Schools implemented Marcus's tree, a curriculum designed to teach empathy, inclusion, and the value of standing up for what's right. The local police department underwent a complete overhaul. Officers now attended regular training sessions on disability awareness and cultural sensitivity, and a community oversight board ensured accountability. The changes weren't perfect, but they marked a commitment to doing better. Lucas, the jogger who had recorded the fateful day, reflected on the town's progress during an anniversary event at the park. "Fairhope didn't just change for Marcus," he said. "It changed for all of us, and it's proof that when we stand together, we're unstoppable." National impact. The impact of Marcus's story was felt nationwide. Marcus's law, now enacted in several states, set new standards for policing, emphasizing de-escalation, accountability, and the inclusion of mental health professionals in crisis situations. Advocacy groups hailed it as a turning point, a tangible step toward a more just system. Social media continued to amplify Marcus's message. His artwork, particularly his drawing of the tree encircled by hands, became an emblem of hope and justice. The image appeared on t-shirts, murals, and even banners at protests, uniting people under the call for change. Marcus and Lisa were invited to speak at the United Nations, where they shared their journey and advocated for global reforms. "Every life has value," Lisa said, her voice steady with conviction, "and every story, no matter how painful, can inspire change." A message to the world. In their final public address about their journey, Lisa and Marcus recorded a video at Marcus's garden. The camera panned across the park, capturing children playing, families laughing, and the mural depicting Marcus's tree. Lisa spoke first. "To everyone who has followed our story, thank you. Your support turned our pain into progress, our tragedy into triumph. But this fight isn't over. Real change takes time, effort, and courage." Marcus held up a sketch of his tree, his voice soft but resolute. "We're growing together." Lisa nodded, her gaze steady. If Marcus's story inspired you, please share it. Let someone else see that no matter how dark it gets, there's always a way forward. Like this video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to join a community committed to justice, empathy, and unity. The video ended with a wide shot of Marcus's garden, the sun setting behind the tree that had become a symbol of resilience. The screen faded to black, displaying one final message. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.